Great. So I'm just going to start with, whoops. Okay, so first I'll talk a little bit about our commission, and then Vermont, give some context around Vermont. Next, the enabling legislation. I'll kind of go through what is the statutory framework that we're working under for PBR. And the primary utility that I'm going to be talking about is our energy efficiency utility. So I'll go through sort of the process we use, the metrics, and then how compensation is tied to those metrics. And then toward the very end, I'll get to where we are in the process with our largest electric utility. We're much less far along there. So our commissioners, these are our commissioners. We've got Anthony Roisman, Margaret Cheney, and Riley Allen, and they're all delightful human beings. There they are. You may see them at the Winter Policy Summit. So Vermont is a very small state. Our peak is around 1,000 megawatts, and we have like our largest distribution utility covers around 80% of customers, and the remaining customers are covered largely by municipal and co-op utilities, so not-for-profit entities. We only have one statewide kind of bulk transmission provider, and another unique piece of Vermont regulatory context is that we are vertically integrated. So our utilities own generation and the distribution grid itself. So that's a little bit unusual. We're in ISO New England, so we're kind of operating under an ISO umbrella, which is nice and convenient. And then another tidbit is that 93% of our electricity is carbon-free. About 66% of that is nuclear, and another 27% is renewable. So I like to say we're leading in obscurity up here in Vermont when it comes to climate initiatives. Okay, so I'll just jump into the statutory basis. We maybe wouldn't necessarily be able to do performance regulation if we were in sort of a traditional rate-making context, but we have specific authorization from the legislature to do performance-based regulation in the efficiency space. And I've included a statutory reference and some language here that kind of gave us authorization to use performance-based regulation. And that has been in operation for about 20 years. So our efficiency utility was created in the year 2000, and since day one has been most of the compensation, like historically about half the compensation, and we're moving in the direction of more of the compensation being tied toward performance-based metrics. Electric and gas, we've had the statutory authority to do alternative regulation, which includes a lot of different sort of structures outside of traditional rate making, including some performance regulation. We haven't managed to actually tie any money to performance-based metrics in the electric and gas space yet. But we do have kind of legislative authority to do that. So a little bit of background on our energy efficiency programs. So we have standalone energy efficiency utilities. There are 3 of them. There's Efficiency Vermont, covers most of the state. There's Burlington Electric Department, which covers just the city of Burlington. And then Vermont Gas is our natural gas utility, and they have their own wing of an efficiency utility that does largely thermal efficiency. So basically, we measure their progress every year. Let's see. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there. So it's a little unusual that it's not our DUs doing efficiency. For the most part, it's like a standalone utility. Okay, so I'll talk a little about the process for how we set our metrics. Every 3 years, we have a very highly litigated kind of process that we call the demand resources proceeding. I might not have that acronym right. Actually, my boss, Tom Nauer, who's our policy director, is on this call. I just want to like give an invitation, Tom, to jump in at any moment and be like, that's not right, it's actually this. I'm not an efficiency expert by any stretch of the imagination, and Tom's been doing efficiency for like 10 years. So I'm going to say a lot of wrong things. Tom, I'm just counting on you to jump in. So yeah, it's quite the process. We start with like an assessment of all the potential efficiency that's out there, and that gets sort of argued about and litigated. And then the efficiency utility puts forward a proposed budget, and our state energy office / consumer advocate, we have those are one thing in Vermont, comes back with counter proposals. All this litigation takes like, I don't know, 18 months. It's very intensive. So this proceeding establishes both the overall budget for our efficiency utilities and also the QPIs, which quantifiable performance indicators. I actually had to look that up because we use QPI so much. It's whatever, alphabet soup in this field, as you know. So this proceeding includes not just the efficiency utilities, but also the distribution utilities and even third parties sometimes come into the process. And that could be like the environmental NGOs, but it also can be representatives of large commercial interests. We've had a variety of participants in those proceedings. So I included a case number there in case you don't have enough work on your plate. You can always go and look up some of our documents from this case. And we usually include 2-3-year performance periods. So the first performance period, I'd say that's like where the rubber hits the road. We're actually setting out the metrics, we're tying compensation to it. The next 3-year period is more of like a forward looking, like what do we think is going to happen in the next 3 years? But we'll have like another proceeding before we actually get to spending money in that period. Let's see, sorry, I'm like having trouble navigating my slides. Okay. So now I'm going to get into what are the actual metrics. So I'm going to phrase this in sort of 2 sections for efficiency utilities. First, we're giving them money to do good stuff. And then the second part is we're taking it away if they don't meet their minimum standards. So let's do the QPIs first. That's like we're giving them a cash incentive to do good work. This is an example from our most recent proceeding of what are the targets they're shooting for. And sort of so this column that says 100% of target, if they meet 100% of that, then they can get compensation in the award weight category. That's like on the rightmost column. So for example, I'll just like talk through one of these. So the total resource benefit is like a net present value calculation that includes electric, fossil fuel, and water benefits. And we've kind of have another proceeding to establish like, how do you calculate that? So they are shooting for this number, which is around $305,000 worth of net present value savings. And the award weight is like what percentage of the performance-based compensation is on the table in that category. So they can earn up to 25% of their performance-based compensation by fulfilling that category. And there's something I didn't put on this slide, but I wish I would have, is that for all of these targets, the way that we've structured it is that they're actually ranges. So they don't start earning money until they hit a floor, a certain amount of value. And then once they hit this ceiling, that's what you see in the 100% target category, that's when they stop earning. And I actually think it's very helpful and important to have ranges when you're establishing performance metrics, because early on, in some categories, there was no ceiling. You couldn't like say, okay, once we hit $305,000, like we've stopped earning in that category. And the tendency for utilities is to then sort of put all their eggs in one basket. If they think they can do really well on a certain metric, they're going to really go in that direction. So if you're trying to get a balanced performance across metrics, you want to make sure that you've got a cap on what they can earn in each category. So yeah, each of these has ranges, and they're sort of measured differently. Some of them are in like peak shaving, some of them are just like in annual megawatt hours, yada yada. So we can get into more details and questions if people want to know more about like the specific metrics. So then the next category, so this is like, okay, you're earning, and then we get into what are the minimum performance requirements. And I just chose 3 here because there are a lot of minimum performance requirements. So after we've kind of tallied up how much they've earned through their performance-based, like their performance against their targets, then if they don't meet these minimum thresholds, we can actually reduce the amount of that performance award. And interestingly, there are more minimum performance requirements than there are the regular QPIs. So this kind of sets a minimum standard for performance that they really are shooting to meet. And then you can see on the rightmost column that there's an impact to their earnings there. So this one of total electric benefits divided by cost is greater than 1.2. And that just means like, we think the value of the energy you save is at least 1.2x the money that you spent. So if your portfolio isn't overall cost effective, you make no money. We take away your entire performance award. So that's the most like drastic one. But then we've also set these other ones. Like for example, spending in the residential sector has been a tricky area for efficiency because it's much easier to go after the large industrial customers. You kind of get more bang for the buck, but we want to make sure that there's equity across kind of the different sectors. So we've established this target of a certain amount of spending really needs to go to the residential customer. And if the utility doesn't meet those spending targets, their performance award is going to be reduced sort of proportionally. So like in this example of the residential, they could actually lose 18% of their overall performance award if they don't hit that target. So yeah, I find the minimum performance requirements a really interesting feature of our performance metrics. Okay, so now I'm going to get into compensation. Sorry, this slide's like a wall of text, but I'll talk through it. So our primary efficiency utility is Efficiency Vermont. So this slide is like only about them. And the way that we calculate, like, I'm going to use the term profit. It's a not-for-profit entity, but this is like earnings above and beyond what their budget is. So they get reimbursed for their budget dollar for dollar. If they spend $50 million in a year, and that's what we've authorized them to spend, they get that $50 million. Then on top of that, they get what I think in the DU space we might think of as like a weighted average cost of capital. It's like money, gravy on top. And in the case of Efficiency Vermont, what they use that money for is they have a consulting side of the house. And so they spend money over there. They also have like mission-driven activities. They spend money over there. They also have like a really generous compensation package for employees. So some of the extra goes into that. So the way we calculate it is if they have $50 million, we'll take in this most recent DRP, it was 4.8% of their overall budget was kind of gravy on top of money spent. Of that, there's an operations fee currently, which is not performance-based. So they just, if you spent your budget, you get this money. And so that was about 1.35% of their overall budget, and that's in 2021. Then the performance-based compensation was about 3.5% of the overall budget. So there's a significant chunk of money on the table that is performance-based. And the way we measure it is that the goals are set for the total 3-year period. So, you know, that the dollars spent or megawatt hours saved or whatever the goal is, we're measuring it in a 3-year period. But the utility reports to us every single year, where are they at in terms of progress? And if they have made a significant amount of progress toward their goal, like a proportional amount of progress, they can get a little bit of their performance award up front. So in the most recent proceeding, in years 1 and 2, they could earn a quarter of their total performance award if they were making good progress toward their goals. But there's also a clawback provision. So if at the end of 3 years, if they didn't make the goal, then the PUC, we can basically like collect back on that money. So a nice development that I'm happy that we're going in this direction. Also, I should say, like, this is my personal view, not the view of the commissioners at all. Like, there's whatever. So we're phasing out of the operations fee. So starting in the next 3-year period, which we just opened the new proceeding, there will be like zero compensation for the operations fee, and all of their compensation will be performance-based. So we're kind of moving more, even more heavily in a performance-based direction for the efficiency utilities. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes. I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions. I'll spend a couple of minutes on electric utility performance metrics, because this area I'd say is like further behind where we are in the efficiency space. And I'm going to kind of go back to some of the theoretical literature from the Regulatory Assistance Project and others, which really recommends that if you're establishing performance-based targets, there's a 3-step process. First, you want to establish what are the metrics, like what matters, what do you care about, what are you measuring? Then step 2 is you want to benchmark for performance across several years. So you say, all right, we're measuring these things. If we're just tracking it, how does the utility perform against those things over a several-year period? And that then gives you a threshold. You're like, okay, under baseline conditions, you know, they had X hours of outages, or they had X rate increases, or they got X% of their power from carbon-free sources, or whatever your target is. That gives you what's their baseline performance. And then you're either trying to get them to maintain that performance, or in many cases, you want to then raise the bar. So this step 2 is really like, where is the bar at to start? And then step 3 is really establishing your targets. Do you want that baseline to go up over time? Like they're getting more of their power from carbon-free sources over time, and then tying that to compensation. And I would describe the process where Vermont is in this kind of 3-step process really is in step 2. So our primary electric distribution utility is Green Mountain Power. And in their most recent multi-year regulation plan, we set a group of about, I think it's a little absurd. It's like 49 metrics that we're tracking. And we have not yet tied any compensation to those metrics. We're really just trying to figure out like, what is that baseline? Where is that benchmark? So the way that we've done this is through multi-year regulation plans that are authorized under 218D, which is the statutory section I went over earlier. And those cases in the past have been every 3 years or maybe every 4 years. And the performance piece of it is a relatively minor piece. There's also in those proceedings, we're looking at like overall earnings and what is their capital spending cap and how are we, we have quarterly adjusters for power supply costs and things like that. So the performance-based piece is just part of that relatively large proceeding. Okay, so the metrics, like I said, there's kind of a lot that we're tracking right now, and I think we're going to zero in on probably 3 or 4, maybe 5, maybe, who knows, to tie compensation to in the future. But I would break them down into these general categories. Capital expenses, sort of what's their power portfolio, distributed generation, specifically DER, and that's sometimes gets confused with distributed generation, but I would distinguish the two by saying that DER, distributed energy resources, are more of a dynamic control type situation. So the utility can kind of reach into the customer side of the meter and dial up and down either their output for generation or kind of loads. Electric vehicles, customer service, storage, and then low income access. Yeah, oh, there we go. Okay, great. So those are the 3 broad categories. And then I just pulled out a couple examples because there really are a lot. And if anyone's interested, I could send you the full set. It's, a page of PDF with like tiny font. So capital spending, I actually think this is one area it's important to not lose focus of. We kind of think of PBR as ideologically trying to move utilities away from a model where they're motivated to spend additional capital. But you also want to make sure that they're spending enough to maintain their distribution system. So when you move in the direction of PBR, there could potentially be an incentive to focus on the metrics that you've identified for compensation and putting money into those areas while maybe neglecting your system if you don't have adequate kind of targets in place that focus on just distribution system, either spending, but also just like reliability, kind of those basic targets. Oh, sorry, I just noticed a mistake on this slide. This capital spending target does not have to do with interconnection. So basically in capital spending, we're measuring, did you spend your cap and, what did you spend it on? Was it like maintenance you actually needed for your system? Sorry, that's not totally correct. Okay, then power supply, one metric we are measuring right now is what is their overall emissions profile? And that's measured in pounds of CO2 per kilowatt hour delivered. So our hope is that over time, the system will get less carbon intensive. Distributed generation, so we have a very active net metering program. And so interconnection wait times, we've basically been measuring interconnection wait times and trying to get those down. Distributed energy resources, our utility is providing kind of these in-home battery systems and other things. So we're measuring how many hours of backup power are they providing to their customers during outage events. And then in electric vehicles, we also have some programs where the distribution utility is buying level 2 chargers for customers. The customers install it in the house and they agree to be on a dynamic rate where the utility can reach into the house and say, charge your car now because we have lots of power. Don't charge your car right now because we're peaking. So we're kind of trying to measure, are we actually saving money in that program? How's that program going? And then new this year, we added 2 metrics related to low income access. So we have historically seen in Vermont, and I'm sure this is true across the US, that low income folks are much less likely to access clean energy programs, including weatherization, efficiency services. This metric talks about kind of rebates for electric vehicles and other things like that. And so we developed a metric so that the utility can really start focusing on how many low-income customers are we bringing into the clean energy programs that we're offering. So that's a couple of examples. Okay, so this is my last slide. I'm just going to go through a couple of the lessons learned. A lot of these are coming from the efficiency space. The first one is that benchmarking the targets is really quite important, and it can take a really long time. So you sort of think about what you want the targets to be, then you're measuring over time, what's our baseline? And I think one thing we didn't expect is that because of the timing of these cases, for our distribution utility, we had the last case 3 years ago, but like you have to wait for the whole fiscal year to close to get data back. So when we were doing our next 3-year plan, we only had like 1 year of data from the first plan. And so I was a little bit like, oh, right. We have to wait a couple of plans to fully benchmark these before we can get targets in place. And then the other thing, I think that we've learned is that utilities really do respond to incentives. And so you want to be really mindful of the incentives that you're choosing. So the last EU plan that we had, like it had those 49 metrics, it's just like too much. I think if you're really going to start tying performance together with compensation, you want to target just a few metrics at first so that everyone gets used to the process and you're not tracking too much data at one time. Also, especially for smaller utilities, they're not really going to be able to focus on a whole bunch of metrics all at once. So like, I don't know if you are all familiar with the Rio process in England. I think they had a similar chart of like 45 metrics and utilities performance just all over the place. So really focus in on what you care about and choose a few. And then, yeah, utilities really do respond to incentives. We've seen our efficiency utility over time, like laser focused on achieving the goals that we lay out in the QPIs. So even though it's a relatively small part of their budget, it's just 4.8%. It really can drive utility behavior. And then this is a little tidbit, number 5 here, that I'm interested in exploring more, which is, do you have a process for checking back in on how the utility did? And if you're seeing that like year after year, they're hitting every single one of their performance targets, does that mean that you need to raise the target a little bit? Like, is the bar set too low? It's too easy to achieve and the utility's just getting there every time. Can you keep kind of eking those targets up and see what happens? Oh yeah, and then the last little point here is establishing those minimum performance standards around the basics really is important. And so I think, especially in an era when the grid is changing, we're decarbonizing, there's so much new technology coming out, we're really interested in and focused on things like EVs and decarbonization and sort of like newer, cybersecurity, but it's really important to also maintain focus on those kind of more traditional aspects like control of rates, system stability and reliability, because you don't want to lose focus on that. And I think having performance regulation can disincentivize your utility from making those investments that are required to keep the system running. So I think that's the end of my slide deck. Maybe we should just open it up to questions. If you have a question, you can just pop it in the chat, or I think feel free to unmute. I don't know, Commissioner Anthony, I'll let you run the show on that. I'm not totally sure how we want to do it.
Yeah. Thank you, Joan. Thank you so much. That was really fantastic.